being able to communicate science in ways that are accessible to a broad public audience is a tremendous competency for graduate students and tremendously entertaining for the rest of us in the audience. So we're really excited about this. This topic was inspired by Dr. Strickland's Nobel Prize-winning work, and this iteration of Gradtalks focuses on the very broad topic of health and technology. What fundamental research is under development today? How will that research potentially redefine healthcare in the future? How is technology being applied? So we have Amanda, who will discuss leveraging data visualization and knowledge translation, as you heard, while Mayank investigates the biomedical effects of knee brace to assist with patient injury and recovery.
How do we, as researchers, take what we're doing, take our findings, and translate that to people outside of the world of research? We publish manuscripts, right? We publish academic manuscripts in academic journals that a few of our colleagues will read, but in all likelihood kind of just sit in this vast database of literature. But people who work in policy, practice, and industry aren't typically very interested in reading through our long manuscripts to find the information that they're looking for. So this is a pretty standard example of how we present information in public health. And I'll give the caveat of, I'm specifically referring to my own domain of public health, so I mean kind of quantitative research of humans in public health, in the domain of epidemiological research. On the left-hand side, we have an odds ratio table, pretty typical in public health, and it shows odds ratios and corresponding confidence intervals in brackets. And this is completely meaningless unless you know how to interpret an odds ratio. And in fact, it's probably still pretty meaningless even if you do know how to interpret one, because you're going to have to go through my method, see how I coded it, and then you can kind of start to interpret it. I am part of a much larger research team within applied health sciences called the COMPASS study, whose principal investigator is Dr. Scott Leatherdale, who's here today. Hello, Scott. And the COMPASS study is a large study of youth in Canada. So we are in 4 provinces and 1 territory in Canada, and we study youth in grades 9 to 12, so high school students. And we look at a variety of different health behaviors, so things like diet, physical activity, substance use behaviors, and by that I mean like cannabis use, alcohol use, tobacco, e-cigarettes, that kind of thing. We're looking at about 1 million data points, and that's only for 1 year, and we have 7. So you can imagine that we have a ton more data that I can even really explain. And we are super blessed as researchers to have so much kind of robust, high quality, high quantity data, but it's almost to the point when you get to have this much data, you face a barrier that you almost don't know what to do with all of it. So this is the publicly accessible data visualization map that I designed and built in order to try and tackle at least tackle some of the problems that I was just talking to you about. So I designed this map kind of for what we in public health vaguely refer to as decision makers. So that would be, for our purposes, that would be people like Health Canada or people who work at Health Canada, Canada, Public Health Ontario, those kind of government organizations, but some non-government organizations as well. And I had to kind of keep 2 main considerations in mind. The first being, I can't really expect those people to know everything about our study or be particularly tech savvy. So the design has to be simple enough that pretty much anyone can use it. And it has to be far simpler than that raw data file I showed you earlier. And the second thing is, I needed to allow people to look a little bit further into the data than just looking at specific percentages that they could get in, say, a table. The way I think of data visualization is a method of storytelling. It's a way of conveying information outside of what would be considered the norm in academia. as researchers, I'd like us to start moving away from publishing manuscript after manuscript and wondering why the people outside of research, so people in policy, practice, and industry, aren't using the research findings that we're putting out there. We can start better using the technology that's available to us in order to communicate more effectively and better, and data visualization, hopefully I've illustrated, that is one way to do that.
This is Alex Morgan, and she has suffered a non-contact knee injury. And you might be wondering, how could she have suffered a knee injury if nothing contacted her? Well, it's because she executed a sudden change in direction. There's two prominent bones above and below your knee joint. The femur or thigh bone connected to your hip, and your tibia or your shin bone connected to your ankle. If the femur rotates clockwise, the tibia goes counterclockwise, that ends up inducing a very violent and painful corkscrew rotation right in the middle, which is where your joint is. So on the left, you can see a joint that has asymmetrical joint gap from one side to the other. When you see a close-up, you can see that there is bone-on-bone contact. So I implement this knee brace. It uses a 3-point unloading mechanism or a 3-point leveraging system, applies a force on the femur, a force on the tibia, and a rotation closer to the joint. This induces a more symmetrical or normal joint layout. You can see that the space is now more even and that there is no more bone-on-bone contact or grinding. On paper, it works simple enough. What effect does the brace have on the meniscus? All right, simple enough. So let's go and test the brace on a human. But there's a few problems with that. And the first is, because the meniscus is so deeply contained, you really cannot get any instruments or perform any sort of manipulation without cutting the knee joint open. So human testing was not really possible. We decided that the next best alternative is to perform testing on cadaver specimens. We wanted the cadavers to be able to replicate the human or human body movements as closely as possible. So we went and took a page from the film and gaming industry and used something called motion capture. You've all seen stuff like this, where you put a bunch of sensors on a human being and then map their movements into some sort of digital domain. We collaborated with the Department of Kinesiology and made a healthy participant walk and squat. We then built a dynamic knee simulator that's able to replicate these movements. This is a cadaver performing a squat on the knee simulator. It's doing exactly what that healthy participant did. Here's the same thing, but with a brace implemented on top. So we're now able to see what the effect is with and without the brace. So this is one gait cycle of a walk performed by the same cadaver specimen wearing the brace. The first thing we showed is that both braces are effective in reducing or producing the same amount of joint relief for all activities. And that was a huge plus. Because if either of these braces were to be prescribed to a participant or a patient rather, you would want that patient to have the same level of relief if they were walking or climbing stairs or bending over. So that was a huge finding from this study. Second thing we went and tested is, if you recall earlier, I said meniscus injuries don't really happen unless the ACL is injured. And that was a huge benefit of being able to do cadaver testing. We went into the cadaver, and similar to this, we went and cut the ACL. So that cadaver is now in an injured state the same way an athlete would be had they torn their ACL. And we went and repeated all the simulations in a brace and unbraced scenario and compared healthy versus injured ACL states. We showed that while the brace was very effective at providing relief with a healthy ACL, it was not effective with an injured ACL, and in many situations, it even induced more harm. So we were able to make a clinical recommendation that these two braces in particular should not be prescribed to patients who have an ACL injury. Now, both of those are transformative and were extremely valuable for the manufacturers for future or further developments. You might remember in the vehicle industry or in car commercials, you've seen crash test dummies used to test seatbelts or airbags. Car companies don't really do that anymore. They built a human software model to test their products, their vehicles. It's just too expensive to do it experimentally. So we thought, well, the entire field of biomechanics is really shifting to a more software approach to avoid the ethics and constraints of experimental testing. So we went and took just the right leg from this model and extracted it. And currently, we are trying to replicate our experimental simulator on this software model. The software has a slew of advantages. The first being is that softwares can be used by many research institutions. They can be easily learned. So overall, it really helps the field grow. The second thing is that you can get a lot more information from a software model. You don't need sensors or equipment for every single thing that you want to try and measure. You can also modify your parameters as much as you want. I can only push a cadaver specimen so far before it breaks. I can push this as far as I want to see what the upper limits are. Amanda mentioned policy, practice, and industry. You can use technology as much as you want, as extensively as you want, to try and improve healthcare. But unless your findings and your research is not communicated effectively, you're only going to go so far. And that's what the point I want to be as a takeaway, is that there needs to be more collaboration between departments such as engineering and applied health sciences, to ensure that information can be communicated as effectively, as clearly as possible, to help enact policies, improve practices, and enhance or progress healthcare industry.